Well, what I think is interesting about it, and it leads into our next industry story here, is that it speaks to the fact that for all of the talk of generative AI, or for that matter, agentic AI, that you cannot ignore the fact that so much of what the enterprise is doing is in fact very traditionally workflow driven and connecting systems. And we don't need a whole lot of that we'll call it the probabilistic AI type layer. It's like we know exactly what we need to get done. I think there are some interesting aspects to it because the challenge with these deterministic workflows, particularly when there are these long workflow chains, is the fragility that brings, right? Because
Hmm.
anything in that chain changes, then it breaks. And that's where AI, agentic or otherwise, can provide some interesting value. And to that end, so the other news is that N8n, I think we're saying the name right, which is it's interesting. This article on TechCrunch calls them a fair code pioneer. I think that's part of their thing, but really they're a workflow automation tool along the same lines as Tines. Um, and actually, well, I mean, this is where it's like, would you consider Workato in there? I think probably, or even like the RPA type players are also
Hmm.
sort of in the same category, right? And it's interesting because they just landed another $60 million round, and um, and they're this interesting space. So we're going to talk in a minute about Symphony AI, but one of the things when I joined Symphony AI is I was like, what's the competitive landscape? And several people pointed me at N8n, and I looked at it and it's like, oh, they're not really. I mean, they're very much a workflow player, but like anybody else, they have tried very hard to push into that space between workflow, low code, and AI. And I think it's just interesting because you sort of look at this whole landscape and what you're seeing is it's all merging. And so the Workata story we just talked about is another example of that. It's like the lines continue to blur and it's getting harder and harder if you're the CIO, harder and harder to sort this out. Where do what parts of it matter and how do you put these pieces together? So I thought it's interesting mostly from that standpoint. And we didn't talk about it last week, but Tynes also just got another big round, right? So this is a
Hmm.
space that is still seeing a lot of investment. So I don't know, what was your perspective on this?
Yeah, this is definitely a very frothy time, and I think it's going to be hard to see all of these companies succeeding, but well, one of these companies, at least one or more, are going to show up as the AI support for casual workflows, which is what a lot of this is. Being able to type, I want X to do Y at Z, and then the tool figures out how to write those 100 lines of code to make that happen and make it programmable and repeatable. But honestly, I see a bunch of what is happening here, and I think it's not that different from, oh, go back to Zapier or if this then that, doing simple things that don't require a whole lot of competition necessarily. I see this market, this side of the market, the more casual consumers-ish side of the market, being a bit more like, say, the scheduling market, where where you have a couple companies that can automate scheduling for you, but you don't need 50 companies there. At least not yet. I don't see N8n being that successful on the enterprise side. That there just isn't the same level of control or governance, right? As you probably,
Yeah,
right?
so I think two things. I think N8n is clearly positioned at what we'll call the lower end of the enterprise or the SMB market or the mid market, right?
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, that's where they're targeted. You can look at that by seeing who their connectors are, right? The type of applications they connect to. That's clearly who they're sort of targeting. The other thing I thought, though, that is interesting, and this is true of Workato, this is true of N8n, this is true of Zapier, right? What is interesting about them is there's an orientation that you have to look at. And this isn't good or bad, right or wrong, in my opinion, right? I think there's not even room. There's a net need for both.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at how N8n or these folks are leveraging AI in their workflows, it is typically I've got a deterministic workflow that somewhere in there I make a call to an LLM or I make a call to an AI agent or I do
Mm-hmm.
something, right? Where they're workflow centric, right? It's the workflow first. AI components can get called based on the thing. And I think there's plenty of use cases where that makes a ton of sense. And then there's other approaches, right? Most of when we talk about agentic AI, it's typically the other way around, right? Where it's the agentic AI flows as the point of centricity, and then you make calls to a workflow as an execution point. And so that's where these sort of can live happily together. And there's a degree of recursiveness, but I think it's really interesting. And so to your point, I think that there's going to be a shakeout, and I think it's also going to be about figuring out as an enterprise what parts need to be deterministic, what parts need to be agentic, what parts should be of prominence or not, and when does it matter. And I think it's not, like I said, it's not good or bad, right or wrong. I think the answer is going to be all of the above, but it's going to be very dependent on the problem you're trying to solve. So
Yeah,
we'll see
that's
how it
probably one of
works.
the most fun parts about simply looking at the problem right now. Figuring out what needs to be deterministic, what needs to be probabilistic, what needs to be portfolio based. Yeah, that's the fun part. And I just
Exactly.
wanted to give a quick shout out that you mentioned the fair code, the concept that N8n has been pushing. And this is the idea that software developers can be compensated for the open source work that they do once that open source work gets commercialized. And I think that's going to be an increasingly important issue as we have more independent developers doing more gig work type things, and figuring out how that work actually gets compensated in a world where it seems like all the money is going to big tech, and little tech is somewhat struggling to figure out how to take full advantage of what they do. So I'm interested in seeing how that model ends up working out over time at the open source level.
Yeah, and relatively new and just early days of getting traction. So we'll see how it plays out, particularly in an era where we're seeing so much AI based coding and
Mhm.
how that impacts all of that. So.